All right, hello, my name is Tristan Bereau. I would like to thank the organizers for the kind of invitation to speak at this exciting virtual conference. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work we've been doing in the context of soft matter systems in screening compounds. And I'll tell you mostly about doing this using computer simulations, but I will also give you an example from experiments. And so to sort of set the stage, we're interested in soft matter systems. That means a large range of systems going from soap bubbles, proteins, liquid crystals, colloids. And the one thing they all have in common is that the characteristic energy is kBT, so it's thermal energy. What that means is that thermodynamics and thermal fluctuations alone are enough to lead to exciting phenomena such as self-assembly and mesoscale structures. And what this means is it puts a little bit of constraints for us as modelers because or simulators, because that means that we have to take into account entropic effects in a very robust way, so that we have to be able to compute configurational averages. And so I thought I'd start from the sort of typical multi-scale plot that we'll probably see many times in this conference, meaning you have a time scale and a length scale, and your system of interest is exhibiting a number of dynamic range of these scales. What that means is that if you're running experiments or doing simulations of theory, you're typically most sensitive to a part of these, a narrow part possibly of these length and time scales. And so possibly you have to work with different techniques at these different scales. And I wanted to put this in perspective in the context of data-driven science. So we've been thinking about sort of data-driven science as a possibly a new paradigm in science. What that means, what I wanted to the idea I wanted to motivate is that this may actually motivate the idea of a data scale in a slightly different way as what I've been telling you before. The reason why we need a data scale is because, well, we need data in order to do things such as designing new compounds and establishing structure property relationships. So the way you do this is that you take a number of chemistries or materials, and for each of them you run an experiment or you run simulation, and you establish what the material property of interest is. And so that's the so-called forward process. And if you do this enough times and you get enough points, enough material properties, then you may be able to go backwards and infer a backward relationship from the material back to the chemistry. And so you need data to do this, to infer this relationship, because this is this is an inductive process. And that suggests the idea of a scale for the number of data points you have to screen compounds. And that has both aspects, both before and after, in the sense that in the context of the number of measurements, the number of data points you're working with will determine what type of experiments you can work with, in the sense that if you only want to work with a few compounds, you can do this by hand, but if you want to work with 10,000, hundreds of thousands of compounds, you have to automate the whole procedure. And likewise, in general, if you're then using these data points to then trying to infer relationships, the statistical models you work with will typically depend on the regime in terms of the number of data points you have accessible. And so right. So I wanted to give you two examples of sort of this procedure of having measurements and then trying to do some statistical analysis from this. The first one I'll tell you about is from experimental measurements, actually, and this has to do with using synthetic membranes to try to separate gases and do some molecularly selective separation. So that's been sort of an exciting topic for energy efficient molecular separation. For instance, if you want to separate carbon dioxide, one sort of type of material that's been proposed is to use these types of synthetic membranes, so often polymer based membranes, where you feed in a certain gas that's a mixture of different gases, and then and then if you have a membrane that can selectively permeate only one type of gas, then this one will go out through one end of this system, and then the rest of your gas will come out of the other. In terms of designing this material, there are two key quantities at hand. One is the permeability coefficient of, say, the gas of interest, for instance, carbon dioxide. So that's the flux of gas that can go through. And then the other one, of course, is selectivity, in the sense that you want it to be very permeable to carbon dioxide, but not permeable to the other ones. And so that's the selectivity. So that's a ratio of fluxes. And so this leads to a so-called Robson plot. And typically, if you look at this at any sort of time point in the field, it's typically one characteristic feature of this is a sort of rough diagonal, which is sort of this power law here, which is a sort of a timestamp of the types of materials we've been able to engineer in terms of a compromise between permeability and selectivity. And so every so often, this upper bound will move to the right. And so designing better polymers in this context, or designing better membranes, would have to do with sort of designing membranes that go beyond the current upper bound. Okay? So we're trying to go to the right of this plot. And so we decided to try this out with machine learning. So we encode these homopolymers with a fingerprint. This is something that's often used in drug design. So you try to represent different chemical groups by their sort of interactions along the chain, and then you encode this with a bit string. We then take a number of polymers for which we have experimental data, train the model, and then apply it to a larger data set. What we found were about between 500 and 1,000 polymers per gas that we've collected from the literature. From this, we've built a kernel-based machine learning model so that the number of data points is sort of very adequate for kernels. And then we predicted it on about 11,000 synthesized compounds, before which most of them didn't have any experimental measurement for these permeabilities. So we've taken this from the NIMS materials database. And so to give you a bit of insight, I'm showing you here the error of the model, the accuracy of the model. So learning curve, so the accuracy of the model as a function of the number of compounds. And you can see here that, so look especially at the orange curve. So this is for different gases. And you can see that after a few hundred compounds, so here this is a log plot and this is 100, after a few hundred compounds, the curves tend to start significantly decreasing. What's interesting is that there was prior work in terms of using machine learning, in particular neural networks, on this type of predictions. They used only on the order of 100 compounds for their training, and so you can see that you may need actually quite a bit more in order to start reducing the error. So trying to interpolate the space. So once we do this, so here this is again the same Robson plot I showed you a couple slides ago. May not be so easy to see, but in blue you have training points, and in green all the predictions that we've made. You can see that all the training points are under this upper bound, which is this orange line. But we do have a few green points above this upper bound, so that potentially they should be polymers with very good target properties. So what we wanted to do is validate this experimentally in the lab. So we took two of them. So they're shown here. They're sulfone-based materials. These were predicted to be very highly functional materials. And you can see here these are shown in blue and red crosses, and you can see the error bars also from the predictive variance of the kernel-based machine learning model. And the experiments are the circles. And you can see that actually the circles remarkably are basically within the error bar of the predictions. And so you can see that in this case, not only is the kernel, so the machine learning model is accurate enough to give us a robust prediction, the experimental validation sort of confirms these predictions and shows that we can sort of systematically design better gas separating polymer membranes. Now the caveat here is that we had to, the caveat is in the data collection here, that we had to manually collect and extract these data points from the literature, and that's really painful, and that sort of took a long time. And that means that it limits our capacity to do this, to extend this to other systems, or to scale this up to many more compounds. And that sort of really calls for the need for better data infrastructures of these types of measurements. Now, as a second example, I'd like to talk a little bit about doing something similar, so generating databases and then trying to infer get some insight from it, but now starting from computer simulation. So we want to generate databases from computer simulations. We're in the realm of soft matter, so we want to do this for thermodynamic properties. There's been a lot of work going on in the context of doing this for electronic properties. If you think about, if you look at the field of high throughput DFT, for instance, there's a lot of pioneers in this conference who are working on this. Here we'd like to do something similar in the context of soft matter materials, and so that means we'd like to look at things such as free energies, and so generate databases of free energies, for instance. And so as an example, we've looked at this for also another type of membrane, not a synthetic membrane, but now a phospholipid membrane, so to model something that would look a little bit like a biological membrane. And what we've been working with is to look at again, the permeation of solutes across a lipid membrane. So it means the reaction coordinate you're interested in here is this normal to the bilayer. And then what we're thinking of here is the spontaneous permeation of a finite concentration of these solute molecules from one side of the interface to the other. And so this is something you can easily describe with the Smoluchowski equation. It means you can write out what the permeability coefficient should be. This is really a flux of this concentration due to this concentration gradient. This is an integral over the reaction coordinate, which is an exponential of the potential of mean force. And so the potential of mean force is the free energy of crossing this soft interface. And so what we're doing is using computer simulations to sample this potential of mean force, and then thereby computing the permeability coefficient. And so to sample the potential of mean force, we're working with molecular dynamic simulations. We're not working with atomistically resolved simulations. We're working actually with coarse grain models. So that means that instead of modeling every single atom one by one, we actually encapsulate several atoms into each super particle or bead here, as shown here. And so we're using, for the experts, we're using the so-called Martini, the coarse-grain Martini force field, which has been used a lot in the context of biomolecular simulations for lipid membranes and proteins especially. And so in our context, what we're interested in is to doing this for many small molecules. And so what we had to do as a first step is to make sure we could parameterize these in an automated way, so without any human intervention. And so what that's meant was to take, so for given a molecule, find a way to place these beads in a correct way. And then for each bead, we look at the atoms within it. We look at the chemical properties of these atoms, of these chemical groups. And then from this, we pick the right bead type or chemical flavor that we want to encode. And Martini only allows a finite set of these bead types. And so we have to choose the right one. And so we use a completely automated process to do this, including sort of a neural network to predict some of these chemical properties. And the upshot of this is that we can coarse grain small molecules. So from this step to that in an automated way, and basically in an instantaneous way. So we've done this for several million molecules by now. What this means is that it allows us to systematically explore the chemical diversity of compounds that we have in this coarse grain universe, right? So we can try all molecules made of single bead, and we can try all molecules made of two beads. You can see here the combinatorics sort of grow. And And one aspect we're benefiting from and we're really trying to leverage is the fact that in this context, coarse graining reduces the size of chemical space. And so in the sense that all these, so all molecules that are thermodynamically and structurally similar are mapped to the same coarse grain representation. And that's due to the nature of this coarse grain model. It's a so-called transferable coarse grain model in the sense that it has only a finite number of B types. And what it means is that it's not that we have 5 or 6 molecules mapping to one coarse grain representation. It's more like 1,000 to 10,000 compared to 1. And so it's an enormous scale up or scale down in the number of compounds versus coarse grain representations. That's really interesting and something we're really exploring in the context of compound screening, because it means we have only very few coarse grain simulations to run in order to make predictions for many compounds. And so we're using this a lot. And our procedure is the following. So we start from a sort of subset of chemical space here of small organic molecules. We project them on doing some sort of dimensionality reduction in the space of these coarse-grained compounds. Here the main driving force, say, is a hydrophobicity axis. And then from this, so for each coarse-grained compound, we're going to run molecular dynamic simulations, especially free energy calculations, and possibly working with protonation groups to account for the pKa of some of these chemical groups. That means we're going to shift the potential of mean force between neutral and charged compounds. In the end, that allows us to build a surface of permeability coefficients for all the compounds we're looking at. And this is something that was new because suddenly we had enough compounds and enough data points for which we could build a surface of permeabilities. The upshot here, or the interesting aspect, is that we're coarse graining before we're running any computer simulation. And so it means that this leads to a significant reduction in the computational load. So we have very few coarse grain simulations to run in order to make large predictions for large databases. And that's because we use a lot of the physics that we know in order to build a coarse grain model and then use this as part of our procedure. This is the permeability surface that I was telling you about. It's a rather smooth surface at the coarse grain level. One thing we're interested in is to find out what type of chemistry is covered. We've analyzed about 500,000 molecules on this surface. So basically we took every single one of these compounds and then placed it on this surface. That's shown here. So every point is a compound here on this plot. And so we can do a bit of analysis of chemical groups. And so, for instance, here, any blue region here is an overrepresentation of a chemical group. So here, this chemical group here. That means that if you have this chemical group, you're likely to end up on this part of the plot. And I just lost my pointer. My pointer is back. Oops. Okay, so you're likely to end up on this part of the plot. And likewise, if you want to be on this part of the permeability surface, then you may want to include this particular chemical group when you're if you want to design a compound with a specific permeability. So you can go about doing some inverse design here. We've been publishing both inputs and outputs of our procedure, outputs through free energy calculations and so potentials of mean force and also permeability coefficients for up to 1 million compounds. We've also been publishing more recently the molecular dynamic simulations. So really the input here, this is for 600 combinations of drugs and membranes at the coarse grain level. That amounted to about 15,000 molecular dynamic simulations. Of course, it doesn't. What's missing is sort of a proper data infrastructure where we provide the metadata and ontology for all these simulations to make them really searchable. So in the end, using coarse graining allows us to compress this data scale, right? So meaning that instead of, say, if we have an original data scale for for compound screening, coarse-graining allows us to reduce this data scale, meaning that we can work with much fewer coarse-grained representations to then have a representation of this large chemical space. And the way we do this is we take large databases of compounds, we coarse-grain every single one of them, and we see where they end up, and that allows us to map these spaces. One thing we're sort of trying to do more and more is to go back in the sense that we may want to take the coarse-grained simulations and then refine them at an atomistic level to get a more refined prediction. And so this is called back mapping. So we've been more recently interested in doing back mapping using machine learning as well. And here the setting is the following. We start from coarse-grained coordinates. We'd like to predict equilibrated atomistic coordinates that would be conditional on the position of the coarse-grained coordinates. So it's a conditional probability of finding the right or representative atomistic coordinates given the coarse-grained coordinates. We're using generative adversarial networks to do this. Means that we have a coarse-grained configuration. We use a generator to then predict an atomistic structure. And then we have a critic or discriminator to then tell if try to tell if this structure is fake or real. What this allows us to do is to learn the correct Boltzmann distribution, in the sense that we directly from the data that we generate, the atomistic data that we generate has, for instance, the right pair distribution function. And so this is something that's really interesting because it doesn't require additional energy minimization. It's also something that seems to be extremely temperature transferable, in the sense that we trained our model on polymer melt, so high temperature polymer melts, and we could apply it to the crystalline phase of that polymer without retraining, and we got excellent performance in both phases. And so it's something that's really promising in the context of really speeding up and generating equilibrated condensed phase molecular structures. All right, I'm at the end. I wanted to again sort of motivate this idea of linking the idea of compound screening with multiscale simulations, in the sense that multiscale simulations have been enormously useful to understand materials. I think it can be extremely useful at designing new materials as well. We've shown this through sort of establishing structure property relationships for biological membranes here. We're trying to go in the direction of design. Here I've shown you an example from experiments, but I think we can also extend this from multi-scale simulations as well. This is ongoing work. I'd like to thank people in the group who've been working on these different aspects. I'd like to thank collaborators, and I'd like to thank funding. And finally, I would like to thank you for your attention.